Hi everyone, today is day one of the Blitz chess in Croatia. So we've had 3 days of rapid chess. Jordan van Forest leads the field. Now we go into the Blitz section, and this is round 8 of the Blitz. It's Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen. Now Magnus is really storming along. So he just had a great day picking up results, but could Alireza stop him in his tracks? Alireza had a bit of a mixed day here, so let's see what happened. Alireza kicks off with d4, Magnus goes d5, we have a queen's gambit, and now Magnus goes c6, the Slav defense here, but after knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, here Magnus doesn't take on c4, then go bishop f5. This is the mainline Slav stuff, but instead he goes pawn to e6, the so-called semi-Slav defense, where you set up this pawn triangle, reminiscent of a London system, let's say, but the bishop here is inside the pawn chain, and so very often black's taking here, going b5, developing the bishop like that. Very famous World Championship match where we saw a lot of this was Vladimir Kramnik against Vishy Anand, Vishy playing with black. Beautiful games if you've never seen that one. 2008, I think it was. Anyway, e6 played in this one. And now you can go e3 here. This is what Kramnik played tons of in that match. But here we had bishop g5 from Alireza. This is much sharper because you can go into either the Botvinnik variation, the anti-Moscow, all of these crazy gambit lines. But Magnus puts a lid on all of that. He goes bishop e7, so we're back in the kind of more standard Queen's Gambit declined lines. So now e3 played, knight beats d7, queen c2, castles from black, and now rook to d1 from Alireza. It's actually the main move here, delaying the development of this bishop. You're just waiting one more tempo to see if black wants to take there yet. And the rook stands well on the d file. Black very often wants c5 or possibly e5, and then of course the rook stands well. Also, if you ever go e4 as white here, well then the rook holds this pawn. So b6 now from Magnus. He goes for a different approach with developing this bishop. Now bishop to e2 played. You can also go to d3 there. Bishop b7, castles, pawn h6, kicks this bishop back, rook to c8 developing, and Alireza just tucks back off this file here. There's going to be a c5 break soon, some action down here for black. And now Magnus takes here, the bishop recaptures, and he gets c5 in. And he's pretty much equalised in this position after Alireza takes, rook recaptures, and bishop to b5. And you could have gone bishop e2 there, by the way, covered this knight, but this is more Alireza's style really, immediately pressuring this knight in combination with the rook, setting up some tactics, and he doesn't mind if Magnus wants to do this one. Yes, you shatter the pawns, but actually that takes control of e4. White could always sidestep and maybe use the g-file, plus you've given up that wonderful bishop on b7. So Magnus in this position, he actually played pawn a6, kicks that bishop, but Alireza doesn't move it. He takes on f6, and this is a tricky response, because after Magnus captures here, he slams down knight e5, and this took Magnus aback a bit. I don't think he'd seen this one, and it's a really great move. I mean, if you capture the knight, then of course you're losing in exchange, not good. So what else? Well, there's a threat to actually take this knight here. So let's say you actually took this bishop here, moved the knight out of the way, picked up a piece. This is some crazy queen sack line that the computer comes up with. And then after this knight retreats here because it's attacked, well, you go pawn b4, you kick this one, then the bishop hops in here, queen a1, rook c6. The computer says there's enough compensation here, but you're never really going to see a human doing this, just, chucking a queen for this kind of compensation, especially in Blitz. And equally, if you take with the bishop here, well, now knight takes is no good. You fork rooks. I mean, the line actually goes on after rook g5, hitting this one. But long story short, it's good for white in the long term. You can go e4 there, position goes on. Anyway, so limited options for Magnus. And that's why he goes bishop c8 here, covering this attacked piece. And now Alireza takes on e7, queen recaptures, and you can take here with a slightly better game. That bishop's going to be staring at its own pawn. But instead Alireza drops back, also a good move, and it keeps more tension on the board. The rook comes to g5, and now pawn a3 from Alireza. Very calm move. You don't want black to liquidate this one too easily. It could be a target in the future. And now Magnus actually plays an inaccurate move. He goes knight to c5 here, and the reason it's not so great is it then allows white to go pawn f4. Bishop b7 was better, by the way, than knight c5. Anyway, this pawn f4 move is good because the rook's kind of running out of squares a bit. Say it comes to h5, well then you can go b4, knight takes, queen takes, and you've stymied these two pawns here, plus this one's a target, and you've got the d-file, you've got better central control. Even if black gets an attack, you can parry it, and you know, white's doing decently here. But Alireza missed this f4 move here, so instead he actually plonks his knight on f4, but it's not so good, because now bishop b7 came, pawn f3 covered the threat on g2, and now knight a4, great move from Magnus. He'd be very happy to liquidate, undouble his pawns, clamp on this one here. So Alireza doesn't do that. He drops back to e2, and now the rook came to c8 here, and this actually isn't the best move because now Alireza had a really nice shot here of pawn to b4. Again, you stop the pawns from moving, and also you stop this rook from re-entering the game via the c-file, for example, and in some lines it's running short of squares after pawn h4. Now the thing with this move is you have to calculate this, and then there's two pawns hanging. It should be good for white, but it takes calculation. Alireza's already low on time here, as you can see, 30 seconds. So he misses the b4 shot. Instead he goes e4, very logical move, but now Magnus can get this b4 break in, liberates that pawn, also gives this rook an extra square here. So rook d4 from Alireza, pins this pawn to the knight. Rook b5 from Magnus, adds some protection, brings that rook back over, queen d3 hits the rook, and bishop a6 was a nice response here, but Magnus goes bishop c6 instead, covering this square as well, and now it's getting very tactical, because there is a threat here to go pawn to a5, forking pieces, but then you're also attacking this one here, and the best for Alireza was to just take here on b4. Then if e5 comes, you go rook c4, and if black wants to win your piece, well then you can take here. This is the trick, because after you eliminate the defender of the rook, well then you're picking up the rook here, white's doing better. And if instead of actually taking this piece straight away, you go rook d8, hitting the queen, well now it can slide over and hit the unprotected knight. And again, the line could go like this, white's a little bit better. But we didn't have Alireza taking on b4, best move, not easy to see. Instead he goes queen d2, and this sets up a nice kind of trap here for Magnus. If you go e5, which is still playable, well this is probably what Alireza was anticipating. He can take on b4, now after rook takes, pawn takes, looks like black's just winning a piece, but then you can go b3, and the knight's a bit embarrassed, it's actually got no squares. This is the best move, then you can take it, pawn recaptures. Now even here, black's actually a bit better when you run it with the engine, but white's doing well, you would have thought, being a pawn up. So this is probably what Alireza was hoping for. But Magnus doesn't go e5. This is just so classy from the world champion to assess this position as good for black. So instead, he takes on a3. Now this was meant to be impossible, right? Because you're leaving an entire rook, knight on prise to the rook. But then you can take here, this is the point. You hit the queen and you uncover this attack, and then you've got these two connected passed pawns. So queen c3 was played, and now the question is, did Magnus miss this and get lucky, or had he foreseen it? Now I suspect he'd foreseen it really, because you know he's just that good. But he now takes here, because now it looks like, you know, you were doing really well after this, but then white takes here with check. The king moves away. So white's actually a piece up now. But the problem here is that after queen c3 coming back, well now you can actually bring the bishop back to b5. Excellent move. You're threatening to win a piece. The queen still holds this pawn. So the rook defended, and now Magnus goes queen d6. And the computer's calling that a double question mark, because technically you can actually take on e2, that's a bit better. But still, this is a great move here. I mean, Alireza's got 4 seconds on the clock, really tough now. And now e5 came from Alireza, the queen came down, and you can even exchange the queens here, and black's still completely winning, because after knight c3, very logical, hitting this one, covering the square, Magnus now just brings it into c4, supports a2, and that's exactly what we see after rook to a1, and white's just completely paralysed. You're about to run this pawn down, and you just can't do anything to stop the plan. You know, the computer wants h4 as the best move here, nothing to be done. So here we actually had the knight coming back, Alireza gives a piece, good practical try, because after Magnus takes that one off, he can then take here, the rook captures, knight captures, and okay, he's only a pawn down in this endgame. But the problem is, this one is just way too fast and dangerous as an outside passer. So we had bishop c4 hitting the knight, it moved into b4, king g6, and now this e-pawn falls, but if you try and save it with f4, well then king f5, say pawn g3, king e4, this is still completely lost because the king's coming in so quickly and the pawn is running. Again, it's just a lost endgame. So Alireza abandons this pawn, he goes king f2, king f5, knight c6, covers the pawn, but the bishop attacks the knight. It then comes to d8, so that after takes here, you take here, but after king d4, Alireza actually just resigned. The endgame is completely lost, the pawn is running, he knew it, Magnus knew it, he had no time on the clock, threw in the towel. So Magnus was just storming it today. These are the standings on screen. He's top now by 1.5 points, just doing exceptionally well. Alireza's middle of the pack, but okay, we've got some chasers there. Jordan Van Forest, by the way, is just having an amazing tournament, playing out of his skin, so fair play to him. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see the last encounter between Magnus and Alireza, click here. And to never miss a future video, do consider subscribing to the channel, and thanks very much for watching. See you soon.